Hello, and welcome to DE Classified, a podcast showcasing the history of destroyer escorts. Each month, a member of USS Slater's education crew will highlight a specific destroyer escort and share the stories of the sailors who served aboard these trim but deadly ships.
This podcast is published by the educational team of the USS Slater, DE 766. It's the second in a series about the genesis story of all destroyer escorts. But this podcast isn't about the USS Slater or any destroyer escort. It's basically a family story concerning the heritage of destroyer escorts. It's a story about the World War I era four-piper destroyers. They were collectively known as four-pipers for their distinctive smokestacks. They were some of the fastest warships in the world at that time. Their prime armament were guns and torpedoes. The four-pipers were the standard American destroyer during World War I, but most were commissioned shortly after the end of that war. In the early 1920s, the United States had the largest number of destroyers in the world. It would be over a decade before the U.S. Navy started commissioning a new class of destroyers, the USS Farragut DD-348 in 1934. 7 years later, before December 7th, the four-pipers were still roughly half the anti-submarine vessels available, and the majority of the newer destroyers, built in the 30s, were being allocated to the Pacific. There would be a consequence. In mid-December 1941, a British convoy comprising of the battleship HMS Duke of York and 3 destroyers would sail for America. Winston Churchill and his senior advisors were on board. They were meeting with their new American allies to plan the course of the war, the Arcadia Conference. At the same time, Hitler had dispatched a group of U-boats to wreak havoc on American coastal shipping. This was called Operation Drumbeat. The first line of defense were only a handful of destroyers, and a significant portion of those were four-pipers. There were 2 distinct classes still in use, the older Wicks class and the Clemson class. When the Wicks class was designed in 1916, anti-submarine warfare was an afterthought. That year, Congress passed a very expansive Naval Appropriation Act. The Wicks class were designed to support that plan, which authorized 10 new battleships and 6 battlecruisers. The realities of the threat of World War I U-boats soon were apparent. Additional four-pipers were ordered. This was the Clemson class, and a few of the ASW deficiencies were corrected. Sort of. At this time, the Navy actually discussed a more extensive design that basically could have been a World War I destroyer escort. This entailed a reduction in the speed requirement. This could save money and result in a more seaworthy ship that was optimized for ASW. However, it would be sub-optimized for use as a fleet destroyer that supported battleships, and the redesign would also delay production. While adhering to the Wicks design avoided delays associated with the redesign, some creative solutions were still necessary to alleviate production bottlenecks. The rate at which destroyers could be constructed was limited by the number of building slots, slipways, available at shipyards. The same problem plagued the World War II destroyer and destroyer escort programs. In World War I, it was promptly determined that the best option was to pay for additional slipways at traditional shipyards. In World War II, this wasn't deemed viable for destroyer escort production. It was noted that destroyer production delays were cited as a major reason for not proceeding with the destroyer escort program. This argument persisted from September 1940 until June of 1941, a 9-month period. Finally, at a General Board meeting in June of 1941, Captain E. L. Cochran outlined this World War I approach. Simply build additional slipways at existing shipyards. Even with additional productive capacity, two major bottlenecks persisted. One was boilers. A few Bethlehem yards avoided this by using a British Yarrow design. The idea was fine, but in practice these boilers had maintenance problems, and many destroyers equipped with them were scrapped before World War II. The second bottleneck was reduction gears. In World War I, this was solved largely by subcontracting. In World War II, the destroyer escort program designers, Gibbs and Cox, anticipated this problem. They produced several design variations using different power plants, diesels or steam turbines, and electric motors or reduction gears. As a 31-year-old Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a big part of Franklin Roosevelt's job was with naval contracting and dealing with production bottlenecks. He was well aware of all these issues. Late in 1940, he assigned a protege, James Forrestal, as Undersecretary of Navy to deal with them in World War II. FDR also had strong personal ties to four pipers. Before World War I, he sailed with Fleet Admiral William Bill Halsey on the USS Flusser, DD-20, and with Admiral and CNO Harold Stark on the USS Patterson, DD-36. These four pipers predated the Wicks class, and the admirals were only lieutenants. In 1918, he traveled to Britain on the USS Dyer, DD-84, a Wicks-class destroyer. A large painting of the ship sat behind his desk in the study of Hyde Park, New York. Later, in 1918, he traveled again with Bull Halsey. Halsey noted,
"Ships of mine had the privilege of flying his flag twice. Soon after the armistice in 1918, while I was commanding the destroyer Yarnall, I was ordered to take him from Dover across to Ostend. The coast of Belgium had been heavily mined, and although channels had been swept, they were poorly buoyed. A strong tide was running in our channel, and such a thick fog had set in that we had to reduce speed. When we nearly passed on the wrong side of a buoy, I said, 'The hell with it,' dropped my anchor, and sent Mr. Roosevelt the rest of the way in our motor launch. I might have risked him and the Yarnall separately, but not together."
The Yarnall was a Clemson-class destroyer, and it was part of the Destroyer for Bases deal in 1940. In British service, she became the HMS Lincoln. In 1942, she was transferred to the exiled Norwegian Navy, and later in 1942, she was loaned to the Royal Canadian Navy. In 1944, she was transferred to the Soviet Navy. 8 years later, she returned to Britain and was scrapped in 1952. In retrospect, the Yarnall would have made a great museum ship, docked in the East River near another FDR project, the United Nations building. By the way, FDR wasn't the only member of the Roosevelt family who had four-piper experience. Frank Jr., who eventually became the skipper of the destroyer escort UM Moore, DE-442, his first ship was the USS Lawrence, DD-250. This was only a 2-week training session at the East Coast Sound School in New London, Connecticut. Frank Jr.'s younger brother, John, was a Navy supply officer. His first ship was the USS Rathburn, DD-113. Later in World War II, he would serve on the aircraft carrier USS Wasp, CV-18. FDR's eldest son, James, was the executive officer of the 2nd Marine Battalion under Major Evans Carlson, a.k.a. Carlson's Raiders. Early in 1942, He participated with training exercises on the USS Gregory, APD-3, and the USS Brooks, APD-10. In between these exercises, his Marine unit conducted the Makin Island raid. They landed deep in Japanese territory using 2 submarines and inflatable rubber boats. Later in the war, when destroyer escort production peaked in 1944, they were also repurposed, largely as fast attack transports, over 90 ships. Immediately following World War II, the 4-Piper APDs were all scrapped. The DE conversions continued to see action in the Korean War and the Vietnam War. They continued to support amphibious assaults, but they also deployed CIA teams and Navy SEAL units. To highlight the family heritage between 4-Pipers and destroyer escorts, I'm profiling 2 ships from each group that were converted to APDs. The USS Belknap DD-251 was converted to APD-34, and the USS Reeves DE-156 was converted to APD-52. Comparing DD-251 to DE-156, they are relatively similar in dimensions and displacement. Biggest differences are the power plant, the speed, and the range. The DE also had better turning diameter. Regarding weapons, the DE was equipped with better AA and ASW weapons, but had far less torpedoes. The DE complement was higher to support the additional weapons and for added sensors, radar and sonar. Comparing APD-34 to APD-52, on the Belknap, one of the boiler rooms was removed to add troop berthing. More fuel capacity was added as well. The 4-inch 50 caliber single-purpose guns were replaced with 3-inch 50 caliber dual-purpose guns. The landing craft were the early type of Higgins boat, the LCP. On the USS Reeves, a 5-inch 38 dual-purpose gun was substituted for the 3-inch 50 dual-purpose guns. An expanded deck house was added for troop berthing. A newer model landing craft was added, the LCVP. The LCVP has the wide front ramp that we typically associate with Higgins boats. That concludes part 1 of the 4-Piper Genesis story. The comparison of the USS Belknap DD-251 and the USS Reeves DE-156 was made because 2 USS Slater volunteers served on both ships. Lou Grasick served on the USS Reeves, and his oral history is available on our YouTube channel. When the USS Slater relocated to Albany in 1997, Master Chief Dave Floyd was one of our first local volunteers. In 1941, he was an underage volunteer who served on the USS Belknap until 1943. Minimum enlisted age was 17. Chief Floyd was 16 when he volunteered. Unfortunately, we do not have an oral history from Dave Floyd. However, we have the recollections of several Slater volunteers who learned a great deal about 4-Pipers from the chief, including myself. In part 2 of the 4-Piper series, we'll focus on the USS Belknap DD-251 NAVD-A and her service in the North Atlantic. She received the Presidential Unit Citation for service with the USS Bogue, CVE-9, and Hunter Killer Group, Task Group 21.12. After mid-1943, the 4-Pipers in the Bogue Hunter Killer Group were replaced by destroyer escorts. The Belknap was then repurposed as an APD. If there's a future ship or topic that you want us to explore, please use the forum on the DE Classified section of the USSLater.org website. We'll have links available. And please like and subscribe to stay in the loop.
Thank you for listening to DE Classified. This podcast is brought to you by the Destroyer Escort Historical Museum aboard USS Slater. You can find a transcript of this episode, accompanying photos, and a bibliography at ussslater.org/DE-classified. And I hope you'll join us next month when we DE classify another Destroyer Escort.